Before we begin, a quick note on the record. This case is older, and some public reporting repeats the same details without always separating what was proven in court from what was argued, suspected, or later challenged. So, throughout this episode, I'm going to be careful with that language. When I say prosecutors argued something, that means it was part of the state's theory. And when I say the defense argued, that means it was used to create reasonable doubt. And when I say the jury decided something, that is where the court record takes over. Because in a case like this, the tension is not only in what happened, it is in what each side asks 12 jurors to believe. Some crime scenes that investigators walk into and immediately understand: a broken window, a missing purse, a forced door, a stranger's footprint in the dirt. And then there are scenes like this one: a locked office building in Baton Rouge, a young attorney's car still parked outside. Her desk is still holding the evidence of the life she had been building: case files, legal books, the everyday clutter of a woman preparing to stand in court for somebody else. But before the sun came up on February 20th, 2009, the courthouse crowd would not be talking about the case Chiquita Tate was supposed to try that Monday. They would be talking about her. Because inside her law office, just blocks from the courthouse where she had made her name, Chiquita Tate was found dead. Not gently or quietly, not in a way that could be mistaken for anything except rage. She had been stabbed 43 times. That's graphic, and it tells us something. 43 wounds is not a clean escape. It's not a quick robbery gone wrong. It's not the quiet work of someone simply trying not to get caught. 43 wounds say contact. It says fury. It says something personal, or at least something that looked personal enough to confuse everyone standing around that room. Chiquita was only 34 years old. She was a criminal defense attorney, a first generation college graduate, a woman from a family that had watched her rise and rise and rise. She had built herself from expectation, discipline, intelligence, and nerve. She was the kind of person people describe with words like sharp, stylish, fearless, and determined. She defended people other folks had already judged. She challenged prosecutors. She walked into courtrooms and made people listen. And then in the same city where she had learned to use her voice, someone silenced her. At first, the suspect list felt endless. She was a defense attorney. She had clients, enemies. She had a personality big enough to attract admiration and resentment at the same time. There was a mysterious strand of long hair in her hand. There was a missing wallet tossed miles away. There were rumors, tips, old arguments, domestic calls, life insurance, and a marriage that people would later describe in very different ways, depending on which side of the courtroom they were sitting on. And standing in the middle of it all was her husband, Greg Harris, the man who said he bought her dinner that night. He also said he came back in the morning because she would not answer the phone. He called for help. The man who eventually would be charged with killing her. Today, we're going to go back to Baton Rouge, not just to ask who killed Chiquita Tate, because a jury answered that question in court. We are going back to ask the harder question: how did a woman with so much future end up alone on the floor of her office? And why did the people who loved her have to watch her life become evidence? And before this story is over, the jury will be asked to decide whether the strange clues in this case were evidence of another killer or evidence of a killer trying to make it look that way. Before Chiquita Tate became the center of a murder investigation, she was the star of her family. She was one of seven children and raised in large part by her grandmother. Her father was not a steady presence in her life, and from an early age, Chiquita seemed to understand that if she wanted a different future, she was going to have to fight for it. That is not a romantic thing. Honestly, it's kind of exhausting. It means the person in the family who cannot afford to drift. It means being smart, but also disciplined, ambitious, but also practical. It means learning early that talent is only the beginning, the rest is work. And Chiquita worked. She became the first in her family to graduate from college. After that, she enrolled at Southern University Law. While she was studying for the bar, she clerked for a law firm. Then came one of those details that tells you what kind of mind she had. She passed the bar on her first try. That's not small. For a first generation professional, a bar exam is not just a test, it's a gate. It is a room your family has never been in before. And Chiquita walked through it. She chose criminal defense, a field that is not for the delicate. Criminal defense attorneys live in the tension between what people think happened and what the state can prove, and what the Constitution requires. They stand next to people at the worst moments of their lives. They take phone calls at strange hours. They absorb fear, anger, desperation, and sometimes blame. And Chiquita seemed built for the courtroom. People who knew her described her as outspoken. She had personal style, confidence. She had the presence some lawyers develop, where even when they are not speaking, everyone understands they are taking notes. She was not just practicing law, she was making a name. At one point, she won a $500,000 jury verdict, a major professional victory for a young attorney still early in her career. She eventually opened her own firm just blocks from the courthouse in Baton Rouge. It tells you how close her dream was to the center of power in the city. She didn't open an office far away and hope that the legal world would notice. She put herself near the courthouse, near the action, the doors she intended to keep walking through. Her sister Danita came to work with her as an office assistant, and that made the office more than a workplace. It became a family foothold. And then Greg Harris. The way their relationship began has almost become part of the story's mythology because it sounds like an opening of a movie. Listen, Chiquita was out running errands one day. Greg, a contractor, nearly bumped into her in traffic. There was an argument at a red light, the kind of hot, ridiculous exchange that can happen when two strong personalities collide in public. But somehow the argument turned into an exchange of phone numbers. And the exchange of phone numbers turned into a budding relationship. Greg was physically imposing, a big man. Chiquita was strong willed, ambitious, and busy. People around them would later describe the relationship in different ways. Some saw love, others conflict. Some say two people trying to make marriage work. Others saw warning signs. They married in 2008. By then, Chiquita was building her practice, taking cases, and working the long hours that come with being both a lawyer and a business owner. From the outside, life looked full, as it often does. A marriage, career, an office near the courthouse, a woman rising. But full lives can hide private trouble. And in this case, the private trouble would eventually become a part of the public record. The next part of the story begins as plainly as any work night can begin: a lawyer, a looming trial, and one more evening at the office. Thursday, February 19, 2009, started like an ordinary workday. And how often do you hear that phrase in true crime? An ordinary day. Chiquita had court that morning and she spoke to the press outside about a case. She returned to her office. She was preparing for a criminal defense matter expected to begin the following Monday. That is the rhythm of trial work. The week before trial is not glamorous. It's not television speeches and dramatic objections. It's paper, notes. It's reading witness statements, checking facts you already checked. It's making sure that when you stand up in court, you're not relying on memory alone. Her legal assistant, Leslie, left around 5:30 that evening. Leslie was concerned because there was a smell of varnish in the office. And I don't want to say that word as if everybody knows what varnish is. So just in case you don't know and don't want to do that quick Google search, varnish is a clear protective coating that's applied to surfaces, most commonly wood, to protect them and enhance their appearance. So obviously, they had gotten some work done in their office area. And Leslie was just looking out for her boss. She didn't want her to inhale the fumes, so she told Chiquita that she needed to leave. And Chiquita told her she wasn't planning to stay too late. But anyone who has known a trial lawyer knows what that promise can mean. Just one more file, one more call, one more note before going home. Around 7 p.m., Chiquita called Greg and asked him to bring her something to eat. According to Greg, he drove from their home to McDonald's, picked up burgers and fries, and brought the food to her office. He said Chiquita let him into the building. The building was important because after hours, it was supposed to be locked. Access was limited, and according to Greg, he saw other tenants inside as he and Chiquita headed towards her office. While there, they chit chatted, talked, and he said he ran downstairs on an errand for Chiquita. A client was expected to pick up money, deliver some paperwork. He said there were exchanges of pleasantries, and eventually he told Chiquita that he would see her when she got back home. Everything about that exchange, still ordinary. Greg said he went home around 8:30 p.m. After that, Chiquita did not come home. Greg later said he called her office several times, but there was no answers. Hours passed. Then came dawn. There is something uniquely terrifying about a phone that rings and rings when the person on the other end is supposed to answer. At first, your mind makes excuses. Maybe the ringer is off. Maybe she was driving, and maybe she fell asleep at her desk. Maybe she's annoyed and ignored the phone call. But eventually, excuses start to feel thin. Greg went to the office building. He could not get in, so he called 911, explained the situation. He also flagged down a nearby officer with the help of someone who worked in the building. Greg and the officer were able to gain access. Chiquita's car was still in the parking lot. Inside, the officer took one look and understood this was not a missing person situation anymore. It was a crime scene. Family and friends began arriving in the early morning. Among them were people who expected worry, maybe confusion, and the discovery that Chiquita had fallen asleep or left with someone. Instead, they were told she was dead. Not only dead, murdered. And from that moment, everyone wanted the same thing, an answer. But the answer would not come cleanly. What investigators saw inside of Chiquita's office was brutal. Chiquita was on the floor. She had slipper socks on her feet, a detail that makes this scene feel plainly human. At her desk was an open law book suggesting that she had been working when the attack began. There was blood splatter all over the walls. She had been stabbed 43 times. There was no murder weapon at the scene. Her jewelry and other valuables were still there. That mattered because, as one of the first things that investigators look for is if this was a robbery gone wrong. But that didn't immediately make sense. If someone came in for money or valuables, why leave obvious items behind? But her wallet was missing. Her left hand was found open, and in it, investigators found several pieces of long hair. Her right arm was over her head. The hair became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence because it raised a possibility investigators had to consider. Was the attacker a woman? That possibility was not absurd. It was evidence, and evidence has to be followed. If there is hair in a victim's hand, investigators do not get to ignore it because it complicates the story. But the scene itself seemed to suggest a violent, overpowering attack. Police would later have to ask whether the hair was real evidence from a struggle, accidental transfer, or something planted to mislead them. There were other strange details. The blood seemed concentrated around the crime scene. Investigators did not find an obvious bloody trail through the building. No clear bloody footprints, no obvious path showing someone leaving in panic. covered in evidence. That was one of the unsettling mysteries. How does someone commit such a violent act and leave so little obvious traces behind? Investigators began building a timeline of Chiquita's last day. They looked at her cases, clients. They looked at people who might have a grievance against her because she was a criminal defense lawyer. That list could have been long. Some people wondered whether her work had finally put her in danger. Detectives had to take that seriously, and so they investigated. They went down the list of her previous clients and found that a lot of them had alibis because, well, they were in jail at the time of the murder. And if they weren't in jail, then a lot of them had alibis. And it became increasingly difficult to believe that any of her clients would want to murder her after she did her best to help them through some of the worst moments of their lives. And the evidence just didn't back that theory, although it seemed plausible. But they also had to take seriously the oldest lesson in homicide work. The person closest to the victim is often the person investigators must look at the hardest. And that person was Greg. But then a piece of Chiquita's life appeared somewhere it did not belong. Investigators hoped surveillance would answer the basic questions. Who entered the building? Who left? Was there a car parked nearby? Was there a face, a shadow, a license plate, anything? But the cameras did not give them the clean answer of what they wanted. One camera, about a block away, was working. Another, closer camera was not operating because of a recent storm. There was no clear image of the killer. Then came a 911 call from a woman driving on Gadara Lane. She had found Chiquita's wallet in the street, and she recognized the name. She said she was familiar with Chiquita because Chiquita had recently spoke at her daughter's school and made quite an impression. Inside the wallet were Chiquita's identification and credit cards. That discovery raised more questions than it answered. If this was a robbery because her wallet was missing, why toss the wallet where it can be found? Why leave identification and cards inside? Why not use the cards? Why not take the cash and destroy the rest? Investigators developed a theory. The wallet may have been dumped to make the crime look like something else. Maybe the killer hoped someone would pick it up and start using the cards, sending detectives chasing a false lead. And maybe the wallet was meant to pull attention away from the office and toward a random street. That theory would later matter because Greg had a connection to Gadara Lane. When detectives questioned him, they used a common interrogation strategy. They suggested they had camera footage and cell phone tracking that could place him in certain areas. Then they asked when he had last been on Gadara Lane. Greg said he had been there the night before. He said he'd gone there to buy steroids. Given his size and appearance, investigators found the steroid explanation plausible on one level, but on another level, it placed him near the area where Chiquita's wallet was found. Was that honesty? Embarrassment? Coincidence? Or was he trying to get ahead of evidence he believed police already had? That's a problem with a detail like this. It can read two ways. The prosecution would later see it as suspicious, and the defense would see it as explainable. But the jury would eventually have to decide what kind of explanation sounded like the truth. That is where the case starts to become more than who done it. It becomes a question of interpretation. The same fact could be innocent, suspicious, or devastating depending on what surrounded it. Investigators searched the home Greg and Chiquita shared. At first, they didn't find the kind of obvious evidence people imagine in murder cases. No bloody clothing laid out in plain view, no knife sitting in the trash can, and no note of confession. But what they did find is signs that the marriage was not as simple as Greg first presented. In a closet, investigators found a recording of Greg and Chiquita arguing. Chiquita's sister knew there had been problems inside of the marriage. According to the account later discussed in this case, Chiquita told her sister on February 19th that she and Greg could not keep doing the married thing anymore. Greg's family saw it differently. His father reportedly believed their issues came from Chiquita's demanding schedule and the fact that she was often not at home because of work. Greg's brother believed they were trying to heal their relationship. That difference becomes significant later. We all know relationships can get off course and split in half. Now, one side presents the bad moments, the arguments, police calls, threats, the fear. The other side presents the good moments, shared plans, the ordinary affection, the reasons nobody should assume the worst. In Chiquita and Greg's marriage, there had been at least one domestic incident before the murder. 2 months before they married, a 911 domestic call was made. Chiquita accused Greg of hitting her, and charges were reportedly filed against them both. When Greg was questioned, investigators felt he became more hesitant. He did not describe the marriage as perfect, but he said they were trying to move forward despite their differences. He denied being violent, and he said he did not believe Chiquita was leaving the marriage and insisted they were still doing things together. She still had clothes at their residence. After police questioned Greg and got his explanation for their marriage and being on their lane, they arrested him on the warrant for his assault charge that he received during he and Chiquita's argument that resulted in both getting charges. They wanted to gather DNA evidence from him. He was later released. Shortly after he was released, a 911 phone call came in from Greg Harris reporting that someone shot into his bedroom window, and it was only because he was asleep that he survived. That will later become a part of the story in the trial. Prosecutors would later argue that Chiquita was making plans. One of the most significant details was that Chiquita had taken out a lease on an apartment. To the prosecution, that wasn't random. It suggested she was preparing to leave. And then you match that with the account that she said to her sister before she was murdered, and things start to shape up in a different picture. And if Greg knew or suspected she was leaving, prosecutors believe that gave him motive: control, jealousy, money, fear of losing her, a tale as old as time when we talk about true crime. The defense, of course, would challenge that interpretation. A lease does not automatically prove a plan to end a marriage. People separate temporarily, create space, and make decisions and then change them. Relationships are complicated. We all know that. And the defense would use that complexity to push back against a neat prosecution story. But homicide trials are not only about what happened in the final minutes, they're also about context. And the context was becoming darker. Still, if detectives were beginning to look harder at Greg, another lead was about to pull them in the opposite direction. Around the same time, investigators received a tip that seemed to point in a completely different direction. Chiquita had been helping a same sex couple with an adoption matter. The caller suggested that the relationship was not only professional or friendly, but romantic. The caller also claimed that one had scratches on their body. If true, this could have changed the way the investigation went. A romantic relationship, a jealous partner, a female suspect, strands of long hair in Chiquita's hands. Suddenly, pieces might appear to line up. And detectives investigated. They took statements. The women denied any romantic relationship with Chiquita and said she was just a friend. They also had alibis. Then, detectives, convinced that maybe the person who gave this tip might have known something more or might have been giving the story for a reason, decided to trace the tip. It led them all the way to Texas. When they found the woman connected to the call, she sounded like the tipster. They found her. When asked how she knew Chiquita, she said she knew her through her brother. And who was her brother? Well, it was Greg Harris. That was a chilling turn because now investigators had to ask whether Greg's own family was trying to point the investigation away from him and towards someone else. To be fair, Greg's family said the information came through family channels and that they wanted police to check every possible angle. From their perspective, a tip was not a conspiracy, it was concern. But from the prosecution's perspective, that timing and content of the tip looked like misdirection. And misdirection became a recurring theme. The hair in Chiquita's hand, the wallet on Gadare Lane, the later shooting into Greg's bedroom window. Each one could be read as a clue pointing away from Greg, or each one could be read as a part of an effort to create doubt. And that question, staging or doubt, would follow the case all the way into the courtroom. Investigators were waiting on DNA. DNA takes time. Now, that wait can feel endless in a homicide case. Families want answers, detectives want movement, and prosecutors want information before they charge. Defense attorneys, if a suspect is already known, want to know whether the science supports the suspicion or undercuts it. DNA from under Chiquita's fingernails reportedly came back with Greg's DNA and an unknown male DNA profile. That unknown male profile became important for the defense because it suggested someone else may have been involved or present. The prosecution would have to explain why Greg's DNA mattered more than the unknown male DNA and why the unknown profile did not create reasonable doubt. Then came another piece of physical evidence: sunglasses found in Greg Harris's car. The sunglasses were reportedly under the seat. Testing indicated Chiquita's blood was on them, along with Greg's. That was powerful evidence for the state. If Greg had simply brought dinner, left the office, gone home, and returned the next morning, why would an item in his car have Chiquita's blood on it? The defense would argue that if Greg had committed such a bloody murder, police should have found much more. They would emphasize the lack of a murder weapon, the unknown male DNA, the hair, and the absence of that kind of blood trail expected after a violent stabbing. The hair found in Chiquita Tate's hand did not give investigators a clean DNA answer. What made it frustrating was that the strand reportedly had no root attached, meaning it cannot produce the kind of nuclear DNA profile that would clearly identify as a person. Investigators believe the hair appeared to come from a hair extension or weave, which initially raised the possibility of a female attacker or a struggle with someone wearing extensions. But because the hair could not be tied to a specific person through DNA, it became less of a direct fingerprint and more of a mystery clue. Now, let's circle back to the blood evidence, because the defense would argue that it wasn't enough blood evidence found that could prove that he was responsible for Chiquita's death. But investigators also found blood evidence inside of Greg and Chiquita's home. Reports connected blood to areas in the house and even to a Clorox bottle. To prosecutors, that suggested cleanup. On March 16, 2009, Greg Harris was charged with second-degree murder. The man who had flagged down an officer in the morning was now the man accused of killing the wife he claimed he was trying to find. Now, the investigation had become a prosecution, and in court, suspicion would not be enough. Greg Harris went to trial in March of 2011. The state charged him with second-degree murder. In Louisiana, that charge required prosecutors to prove that he killed Chiquita with specific intent to kill or inflict great bodily harm, or under other conditions defined by the law. In plain language, the state had to convince jurors this was not an accident, not self-defense, not some mysterious third party. They had to prove Greg was the killer and that killing met the legal standard for murder. That legal distinction is significant, especially as we just talked about the Carmelo Anthony case last week. A murder conviction would mean in Louisiana that the jury accepted not only that Greg killed Chiquita, but that the killing carried a level of intent required for second-degree murder. Manslaughter, by contrast, can reflect a jury's finding that a person unlawfully killed someone under circumstances that did not meet the full murder standard. Sometimes that means sudden passion. Sometimes it means jurors are convinced of guilt, but not convinced of the state's strongest version of intent. So from the beginning, the courtroom question was layered. Did Greg do it? If so, what exactly did the law call what he did? The prosecution's theory was direct. Greg did not want Chiquita to leave him. Their marriage was troubled. She had taken steps that suggested independence, and there was a possible financial motive because Greg stood to receive about $60,000 in life insurance. On the night she died, he had reportedly asked his boss about getting an advance or loan connected to his 401k, and his boss told him no. The state argued Greg was under pressure, emotional, financial, and marital pressure, and then they argued he snapped or acted with rage, but also with enough calculation afterward to stage parts of the scene. That combination is important. The state was not presenting Greg as a criminal mastermind who left nothing behind. They were presenting him as a man who, in their view, exploded violently and then tried to cover the explosion with confusion. The prosecution did not simply point to a bad marriage. Bad marriages do not automatically make killers. The state tried to build a full picture. Greg's DNA under Chiquita's nails, Chiquita's blood on sunglasses found in Greg's car, blood evidence connected to the home, the missing wallet found on Kadir Lane, where Greg admitted he had been, the long hair in Chiquita's hand, which prosecutors believed may have been planted to throw off the entire investigation, the tip from Greg's sister pointing toward a female suspect, the later gunshots fired into Greg's home. When prosecutors hear this story, they believe that this was all staged to appear as if the real killer was still free. They also brought in testimony about Greg's past relationships. Several former girlfriends testified that he had a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde quality, charming and sweet at first, then controlling or violent when the relationship deteriorated. That kind of testimony can be powerful, but it also can be controversial. The prosecution wanted jurors to see a pattern. The defense wanted jurors to see character assassination. The state played the 911 tape from the prior domestic incident. They wanted jurors to hear, not just be told, that there had been violence or fear in the relationship before. In a courtroom, audio can do something a summary cannot. It can bring the past into the room. It can make jurors feel that the marriage was not an abstract problem, but a living, breathing conflict with voices attached to it. And they framed Chiquita's death as intimate violence disguised as mystery. Their argument was not that Greg left no evidence. Their argument was that the evidence he left was exactly what you would expect from a killer who knew enough to create confusion, but not enough to erase himself. Then the defense stood up and asked the jury to look at the same evidence from the other side. The defense had a hard job, but not an impossible one. Their central theme was reasonable doubt, and that's mostly all defenses' theme. Create enough reasonable doubt that a jury finds you not guilty. They argued that if Greg Harris had committed this extraordinary bloody attack, there should have been far more evidence on him, in his car and in the home. A person does not stab someone 43 times and then magically become clean. Where was the murder weapon? The bloody clothes? Where was the overwhelming trail? They emphasized the long hair found in Chiquita's hand. The hair did not match the simple story of Greg as the sole attacker. It was long. It appeared to be from an extension or weave. It did not have a root, which made DNA testing more limited, but it still raised a question. Why was it in her hand? The defense also leaned into the unknown male DNA found under Chiquita's nails. If Greg's DNA was there, that could be explained by marriage, contact, shared life, or earlier interaction. But an unknown male profile under her nails in a murder case is not nothing. The defense wanted jurors to sit with that uncertainty. They also challenged the prosecution's interpretation of Kadir Lane. Greg admitted he had gone there, but he said it was to buy steroids. Embarrassing. Yeah. Criminal. Possibly. But murder? The defense argued that embarrassment is not guilt. People lie or hesitate about things they are ashamed of, even when those things have nothing to do with murder. They argued the wallet could have been dumped by someone else, that the hair could be real evidence of a different attacker, and the unknown DNA could belong to the real killer. They believed that investigators had focused too narrowly on Greg. interpreting every odd detail as staging instead of evidence that somebody else existed. This was the defense's strongest emotional lane. Do not let a theory become a shortcut. Do not let the state call every inconvenient fact staging simply because it points away from the person they charged. The defense also faced the emotional burden of Chiquita's family. Her sister, Danita, was reportedly torn and nervous. That is one of the most painful aspects of cases like this. Families do not always begin with one unified belief. Sometimes they can imagine the spouse did it. Sometimes they can't imagine anyone else did. Sometimes the person they love is gone and every possible answer feels like another wound. For 16 days, the trial unfolded. Witnesses testified, evidence was presented, and the prosecution told a story of obsession, control, financial pressure, and staged misdirection. The defense told a story of incomplete evidence, alternate suspects, unexplained DNA, and investigative tunnel vision. Then the case went to the jury. After about 3.5 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: not guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of manslaughter. Pause on that, because that is the kind of verdict that can leave every side with a different ache. The verdict tells us something about the jury's thinking, even if we cannot exactly know what happened in the deliberation room. They believed Greg Harris was legally responsible for Chiquita's death, but they did not convict him of the highest charge the state pursued. In other words, the jury did not fully accept the defense's argument that Greg should walk free, but they did not fully accept the state's push for second-degree murder. Their verdict landed in the middle, and middle verdicts can be some of the hardest for families to process. For prosecutors, the verdict was confusing and disappointing. They believed the evidence proved murder. Manslaughter may have felt like the jury accepting the killer, but softening the legal category. For the defense, it was not an acquittal, but it was a rejection of the state's full theory. And for Chiquita's family, it was justice, and not enough justice at the same time. Greg Harris was later sentenced to 40 years. The sentencing details became part of later appellate litigation, including issues around parole eligibility. Greg Harris continued the fight. His conviction was upheld on appeal in 2012. That meant the reviewing court did not find reversible error sufficient to throw out the verdict. An appeal is not a second trial. The appellate court is not usually asking, would we have voted guilty? It's asking whether the trial had legal errors serious enough to undermine the conviction. That is a narrower question, and it is one reason convictions can survive even when a case still has unanswered questions. Now, you remember I said he was initially sentenced to 40 years without the possibility of parole, but he was resentenced to 40 years with the possibility of parole. But the case didn't end there. By 2015, Harris was working with another lawyer to challenge the conviction altogether. One argument focused on the trial judge. Before trial, the judge had disclosed a connection to Chiquita. Chiquita had once been her law clerk. The defense did not object at the time, and Harris's trial lawyer later said he believed that the judge was fair during the original trial. But the later challenge claimed there was more. Harris's new lawyer argued that Chiquita had also represented the judge in a civil matter, and that this should have required the judge to recuse herself. That kind of argument is not just technical. Courts depend on public confidence. A judge does not only have to be fair, the proceeding also has to appear fair enough that the public can trust the outcome. But legal challenges like this often face the higher bar, especially when the defense had a chance to object before trial and did not. Greg's family also said they received letters claiming someone knew who the real killer was, and investigators and prosecutors maintained they had the right man. Those two claims sit on the opposite sides of the same locked door. On one side, a family saying there is more to know. On the other, state saying the case was solved. In April 2016, a Louisiana district court denied Harris' petition for a new trial. Takeaway. What stays with me about Chiquita Tate is not only how she died, is where she died. At work, in the office she built from the ground up, near the courthouse where she was becoming someone most people easily recognized. There's something devastating about that I don't think we should move on from too quickly. The place represented her independence, became the place where her life ultimately ended. The desk, law book, the case files, the building near the courthouse, all of it should have been evidence of ambition. Instead, it became evidence in a murder trial. And that's why we have to be careful with cases like this. It's easy to get pulled into the puzzle. The hair, the wallet, DNA, sunglasses, the timeline. They are the machinery of justice, but they are not the heart of the story. The heart of the story is a woman who had already beaten odds. Chiquita Tate was not supposed to be remembered because of the number 43. She was supposed to be remembered for the number of doors she opened. First in her family to graduate college, passed the bar the first time, opened her own firm, walked into courtrooms, and stood beside people the world had already written off. That's legacy. And maybe that's the painful lesson here. Violence does not only take a life, it tries to rewrite a life. It tries to make the ending louder than everything that came before. But we do not have to let it. It's part of the responsibility of telling older cases. We are not just reopening pain for suspense. We are deciding whether a person's life will be remembered with care or reduced to the worst room they were ever in. We can tell the story whole. We can say Chiquita was brilliant and complicated, loved, ambitious, stylish, and outspoken, a sister, daughter, wife, lawyer, and a woman whose future was still unfolding. We can say the courtroom heard arguments from both sides and the jury made its decision. On February 20th, 2009, the people who loved Chiquita should have been able to call her and hear her voice. They should have been able to fuss at her for working too late, or watch her walk into the courtroom the next Monday, sharp and prepared, ready to fight for her client. Instead, they gathered outside an office building in Baton Rouge while detectives sealed off the life she had built. And years later, we are still saying her name. For this week's True Crime and Current News, we're revisiting the case of Alexis Crawford, a case that many of you remember from 2019. That was one of the first cases I covered on our podcast. Now, just to refresh you, because it's been quite some time, Alexis was a 21-year-old senior at Clark Atlanta University with plans for the future, a young woman who should have been preparing for graduation instead of becoming the subject of a homicide investigation. On October 30th, 2019, Alexis was reported missing after friends and family were unable to reach her. The search for Alexis quickly intensified, and investigators soon focused on two people who knew her best: her roommate, Jordan Jones, and Jones's boyfriend, Baron Brantley. What investigators uncovered in the days that followed shocked the Atlanta community. Alexis' body was eventually found in a wooded area of DeKalb County, and both Jones and Brantley were charged in connection with her death. From the beginning, prosecutors alleged that Alexis's murder did not happen in isolation. Just days before she disappeared, Alexis reported to police that she had been sexually assaulted by Baron Brantley. According to investigators, Alexis told authorities that Brantley had forced himself on her while she was intoxicated. That report would become a critical piece of the prosecution's theory for the case. For years, however, one of the biggest legal battles in the case has centered on whether jurors would ever hear about that allegation. Defense attorneys argued that introducing evidence of the alleged assault would unfairly prejudice a jury against Brantley. Prosecutors, on the other hand, argued that the allegation wasn't just some unrelated event from the past. They maintained that it helped explain the conflict, tension, and motive that ultimately led to Alexis's death. Now, nearly 7 years after Alexis was killed, the Georgia Supreme Court has weighed in. In a unanimous decision released this week, the court ruled that prosecutors can present evidence related to Alexis' sexual assault report at trial. The justices concluded that the alleged assault was so closely connected to the events surrounding the murder that it could not be separated from the story prosecutors intended to tell. In legal terms, the court found the evidence to be inextricably intertwined with the homicide case. So, why does that matter? Because motive can be one of the most important pieces of a murder trial. Prosecutors allege that Alexis' decision to report the assault created a chain of events that culminated in her death. According to court filings, Alexis returned to the apartment intending to confront Brantley after making the report. Prosecutors contended that an argument followed and that Alexis was ultimately killed. They allege Brantley strangled Alexis while Jordan Jones assisted in the crime and subsequent cover up. This ruling is a significant victory for prosecutors because it allows them to present what they believe is the complete context surrounding Alexis's murder. Jurors won't simply hear about the final hours of Alexis's life, they will also hear about the conflict prosecutors say set everything in motion. The decision comes after another recent appellate victory for the state involving recorded jail calls that prosecutors hope to introduce at trial. Those calls, along with social media messages and other evidence, have been at the center of years of pretrial litigation. In fact, one of the most frustrating aspects of this case has been the length of time it has taken to reach a trial. Alexis was killed in 2019, yet here we are in 2026. Her family is still waiting for a jury to hear the evidence, and that's really the larger story here. While these rulings are important, they are also reminders of how slowly the criminal justice system can move. Appeals and evidentiary challenges are designed to protect a defendant's constitutional rights, and those protections are significant. But for families, each delay can feel like another year without answers, another year without accountability, and another year of reliving trauma. I'll continue following this case and any developments regarding a trial date. Before we go, I just want to take a moment to say thank you. The love and support you guys have shown me over the past couple of weeks has been more than what I can put into words. Those were the moments where I was able to get as much feedback as possible to get through the recordings. Your messages, your well wishes, and patience and encouragement truly carried me through all the past 2 weeks, y'all. I also want to thank you for the incredible engagement across all of our platforms. Whether you've been commenting on Facebook, sharing clips on TikTok, sending messages on Instagram, or simply just listening every week, thank you. I see your comments, I read your messages, and I am grateful for every single one of you. And thank you especially for the response to last week's episode. The conversations you all started in the comments were thoughtful, respectful, and deeply engaging. One of my favorite things about this community is that we're able to discuss difficult topics while still listening to one another. And I appreciate each of you who took the time to share your perspective or just simply leave me a comment. If you haven't already, please continue to help us grow by sharing this episode with a friend, family member, coworker, anyone who enjoys thoughtful true crime content. Word of mouth remains one of the best ways to support an independent creator like myself, and every share helps Murder in the Black reach new listeners. And for those of you who are subscribed to our paid content, don't forget that my behind the scenes reflection on attending the Carmelo Anthony trial is available now. I also hope today's discussion of the appeals process through the Chiquita Tate case provided some context for listeners who have been following and who are going to continue to follow the Carmelo Anthony case. While every case is different, understanding how appeals work can help us better understand some of the legal steps and challenges that may lie ahead as that case continues to move through the justice system. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate and review Murder in the Black wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Come on. Y'all know what to do now. Don't play with me. As always, guys, take care of yourself, take care of each other. And until next time, meet me here next Thursday. This is Murder in the Black. Thank you.